channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing a brand new fancy booktube hat. The story behind this hat is that I bought it for an occasion. The occasion is now past and I get to add it to my regular rotation of fancy booktube hats. It is vintage. I got it on Etsy for a remarkably low price, and it fills a niche in my hat wardrobe, which is like large floral. Anyways, this video is a wrap-up, and do you remember the last time I did a wrap-up? I said I had a plan to get caught up on wrap-ups on my channel. Well, behold, the plan in action. So, as you may have noticed from the title of this video, this is a 2-month wrap-up for 2 Februarys from 2 different years. February of last year, 2022, and February of this year, 2023. The reason I am doing this is because January of last year was the month after which I sort of dropped off and stopped doing regular wrap-ups. That's not to say I haven't wrapped up some books from the rest of that year in various batch wrap-ups. I have. So hopefully for each of these 2-year monthly wrap-ups I end up doing, I will have a shorter section for last year. Those will be books, some of which I've already wrapped up and can skip, and some of which I read more than 1.5 years ago now and may not have quite as much to say about it, and I'll hopefully get through pretty quickly to the books from this year. The reason the last wrap-up that I did on this channel, where I said I was gearing up for like a catch-up project, was January of this year, was obviously so that I could get lined up with February and February. So February of last year was an interesting one. I read 5 books, 2 of which I have already talked about, either to a greater or lesser extent in other videos. So I will touch on those 2 books here, but mostly skip over them. And that leaves me 3 books to wrap up well over a year after I read them that probably all deserve a much more in-depth analysis than I'll be able to give them in this video. The first of which is Ancillary Justice by Leckie. I took way too long to get around to reading the Imperial Ratch trilogy. This was published in 2013. These books were wildly, wildly popular in their heyday, and they still have a lot of fans. I took as long as I did to pick this up, in part just because I know I have to be in a specific mood to want to read military SF. And I have had different people tell me different things over the years about whether I should consider this to be military SF for the purposes of like my decision making on whether to pick it up or not. I would say it absolutely is. I think in this first book, there are 2 main plot lines, and only one of them is really a military plot line, and that's the flashback plot line, but like the flashback plot line is a huge part of this book, and it is 100% a military SF story. And thematically, this delves into a lot of the really deep, intense, sometimes disturbing themes about power and authority and use of force that I associate with military science fiction. I remember feeling when I was reading this that like I could imagine this being a book assigned to read in some academic course for which you would write essays upon essays about the themes in this book and be frustrated with the page limit for the assignment. And yet it's still readable. It was a page turner. It had me needing to know what was going to happen next in both of the past and present storylines. So does this live up to the 10-year-old now hype? Yes, I think it does. So in case you've not yet read this book, this takes place in a sci-fi space empire called the Ratch. It's spelled R-A-D-C-H. And the protagonist, Breck, is an ancillary, which is a human body that is taken over by the AI mind of a military spaceship. So Breck is an ancillary of a ship that was called Justice of Torin, past tense, because in the present, the ship is destroyed, and Breck, this one ancillary, is the only remaining remnant of that ship and its AI mind. And this idea of fragmented identity that is expressed through this science fictional ability for one mind to inhabit a multitude of bodies simultaneously ends up being one of the core ideas of this book. The spaceships are not the only intelligences in the Ratch that operate this way. Crucially, the ruler of the Empire, the Lord of the Ratch, is also someone who has made herself essentially immortal and present in a multitude of places through this same technology. This takes the idea of like what happens when a person is of divided mind within themselves as to what to do in a certain situation, and then plays it out over these various plot scenarios where the different parts of oneself can actually act differently. This deals heavily with themes of empire and military imperialism, and the ethics of using ships and their ancillaries that are both highly effective and fundamentally bound to obey orders in the place of human soldiers. The flashback timeline follows the events of an annexation of a planet to the Ratch, to the Empire, where our protagonist, then the ship Justice of Torin, is involved and how things go wrong. It asks questions about disobedience and resistance within the system, and which acts of resistance, if any, within the Ratch can actually be considered to be worthwhile. In the present timeline, Breck is outside the Ratch, alone until she encounters and rescues someone that she knows from her past life as a ship, even though this person obviously doesn't recognize her. And so this other former Ratchai military officer kind of gets unwittingly drawn into Breck's secretive quest, where we don't really know what it is she's up to, but she's up to something. And the relationship between these two characters that is somewhat adversarial but grows and develops over time was honestly the thing in this book that had me most emotionally invested. I was very into these two people having character growth together, and the whole thing where Seyvarden doesn't know who Breck really is sort of scratched my secret identity trope itch a little. You'll notice that I've gone this far without mentioning the gender stuff. For a long time, years, practically the only thing that I actually concretely knew about this book was the gender stuff because it was so prominent in the discourse. And I've put it off till the end here to talk about because A, it is just no longer as radical or revolutionary in mainstream SFF as it was at the time when this book is published, and B, I just don't think it's actually one of the more important themes of the book. I think it is an interesting world-building detail, and that's kind of it. In the Ratchai language, everyone uses she, her pronouns as basically like the gender-neutral pronoun. People do have gender, it's just not like hugely culturally important. So you do get portions of this book that take place outside the Ratch or involve people who are not Ratchai or don't speak that language, and then you do get gendered pronouns for people, but for the Ratchai characters, you have to be okay with the fact that you're not necessarily going to know everyone's gender. I remember really loving this book overall. I don't quite remember why I didn't give it 5 stars. I gave it 4. I don't remember anything I strongly disliked about it. I did revisit some bits of this book before and during my reading of Ancillary Sword, the second book in this series, just about a month ago. I will tell you, I didn't like the second book as much as this one, but I'm still interested to keep reading in this series and in this world. So next in February of 2022 is one of the books that I've already wrapped up and can skip, so that's A Spindle Splintered by Alix E. Harrow. This was one of last year's Hugo nominees for the Best Novella category, and I did a wrap-up of all of those nominees that I read, so I can link that for you and you can find my wrap-up for this book there. At this point in 2022, I was like very seriously reading 2021 releases for Hugo nomination purposes. So the next book I read was The Mirror Season by Anna-Marie McLemore. This is a standalone YA contemporary magical realism novel that is a little bit inspired by the Snow Queen, more than a little inspired by the Snow Queen. But I wouldn't consider it to be a retelling in terms of plot structure. It's more something that is just riffing off ideas and imagery from that story. That is my memory of this, at least. Unlike Ancillary Justice, this is not one that I've revisited recently in great detail in order to read a sequel, so my memory of this one is more vague. This has some extremely heavy subject matter because it's about sexual assault. It is about two teenagers who we learn were sexually assaulted at the same party before the beginning of their school year. One of them, the boy, is a new student at the school, and the girl, I think, is the main point of view character. I don't remember if we get Locke's POV in this or not. It's mostly Graciela, and she is kind of an unreliable narrator of events because of her own trauma response. And I thought this book was very good, but very heavy and a little bit less specifically my thing than some of this author's previous books. This one was more grounded in like contemporary high school life, and like, you know, the rich mean bullies at school and how much power they have because of their connected families, and all of that sort of American high school culture that I have never been particularly interested in reading about in fiction. That's not to say this is a bad turn for their writing, it just appealed a little less to me. I want to say that I know there was also some queer representation in this, as there almost always is with Anna-Marie McLemore's books, but because it has been so long since I read it, I don't remember what that representation was specifically, and I don't want to misstate it on accident. I ended up giving this book 4 stars overall. Next is the other book in this wrap-up that I've talked about previously, and that is Winterkeep by Kristin Cashore, which is the 4th book in the Graceling Realm series, the return to this series after a significant hiatus after the publication of Bitterblue. This was 5 stars for me. I absolutely loved it, and so I did talk about it in my video on my 5-star reads of 2022, and so again, I'll link that video so you can find where I've given some of my thoughts on this book. This one I haven't talked as much about as I think I normally would in a full wrap-up, but it's been long enough that I don't know that I have much more that I can actively contribute to what I said in that video. And then the last book that I read in February 2022 was Winter's Orbit by Everina Maxwell. This is a debut sci-fi novel with a central romance plotline that's an arranged marriage romance. And in retrospect, I probably gave this book 1 star more in my rating of it than it probably objectively deserved. Subjective even a thing, but I stand by that because there was a reason for that. I read this book, if you'll recall, at the end of February 2022. That was when the Ukraine war was starting. That was everywhere in the news. I was glued to that news. It was horrifying. And the main plot of this book is about how the marriage between these two characters and their relationship and their love is ultimately the thing that prevents a horrifying, catastrophic war from breaking out. This was the perfect escapist book for the moment that I read it, and so I stand by that generous 4-star rating that I gave this because I think that's a perfectly valid reason to give a book 4 stars. That said, I do think there's some debut novel weaknesses in the particularly the way these two characters are depicted throughout the book. They are a little bit shallow and a little bit inconsistent. And how well you're going to get along with this book is also going to have to do with how much you're willing to forgive, you know, a standard miscommunication trope and a third act breakup and that kind of really predictable plot stuff. So this takes place in a small space empire. When I say small, I mean they have like several planets, but this is a universe where there are like much bigger political forces out there in the great wide galaxy that are a threat to an empire of this size. Most, but not all of this book takes place on the ruling planet where the royal family lives. Our first of the two protagonists that we meet, Kiem, is a prince of the empire. He is considered to be the sort of ne'er-do-well lost cause of the royal family. And at the beginning of this book, he is told that for political reasons, he is having a very hasty marriage arranged with our second protagonist, Janen, for the purposes of upholding an important treaty that hinges super conveniently for a romance-ish book on marriages between the royal family and representatives of the various planets in this empire. The second protagonist is, of course, Janen. His previous spouse, who was the treaty representative, has died under mysterious circumstances, and Kiem is like trying to tread really lightly with him because of course he was just widowed, but it's pretty clear to the reader very quickly that like that past marriage was not a happy one. It was very abusive, and the miscommunication is that Kiem does not pick up on this at all for way too long. So this is where I think the character work could have used some work. With Kiem, we are basically told his sort of defining character trait we come to realize throughout the book is that even though lots of people think he's stupid, he keeps saying that he's stupid. He's actually not stupid. He just has like really great people skills as opposed to book smarts. But he is supposed to be the people skills guy, and he is missing all of these like wild waving red flags about Janen's backstory here. And then Janen as a character felt a little bit underdeveloped to me. I think the author does him a disservice by trying to withhold some of that backstory so that it's a revelation later in the book. It means that even though we are getting alternating POV chapters, I always felt as a reader like I was much closer to Kiem and understood what was going on with him a lot more. And then at times it felt almost like Janen was almost purely defined by like his unhappiness and his trauma, and I just wanted more from him as a character. This all just sort of felt like debut novel stuff. I am actually very excited to read more from Everina Maxwell. I have Ocean's Echo out from the library right now, and I'll hopefully be reading it soon. In terms of the romance, it does rely pretty heavily on some of those aforementioned romance story trope building blocks, but it's not like steamy spicy. I think everything's fade to black. Content warning, I think if I remember correctly, there is an on-the-page depiction of sexual assault that happens like in a sci-fi memory flashback thing, so it's not like actually happening, but it's there. Two tiny pet peeves. The first is that several times, more than once, the incident that killed Janen's prior spouse is referred to as, I think, a flybug accident with zero context as to what a flybug is. Please tell me that I was not the only person giggling out loud imagining something dramatically different from a plane crash. It's a plane crash. Pet peeve number 2. The vibes of this cover, I think, are overall right. I think it depicts the right sort of blend of like character-driven relationship story and like sci-fi world building. There is like some nature and some tech and some stars and planets. Like that's all right. However, nothing actually depicted on this book cover matches the description of anything that is in the book. I finished the book and I was staring at this cover like, I don't think anything on here is a scene in the book. These two silhouettes don't match the character descriptions or like the descriptions of clothing in the book. I just know that Tor is capable of commissioning exquisite original art for book covers, and I feel like they could have done better for this one. So that's the end of my February 2022 wrap-up. We are going to move on to 2023. I've got 4 books to wrap up here. I own physical copies of 3 of them, and then 1 of them came from the library. And then this is actually a very interesting bridge between these 2 halves of the wrap-up. Because of the year jump, we're going straight from Winter's Orbit to another romantic SFF title with a queer arranged marriage premise. This is A Strange and Stubborn Endurance by Meadows. I read this a year after Winter's Orbit, but because of the February to February thing, we're wrapping them up back to back. So, this is the first book in an intended fantasy series. Meadows is not a debut author, though I've not read their prior books. And I think if you're comparing these 2 books side by side, which again, I was not, I read them a year apart, but if you suddenly are comparing them side by side because of the format of your wrap-up, I think you can tell. I think the clarity and specificity of the character work is better here. These people make more sense. This book, come to think of it, does have a couple other points in common with Winter's Orbit. In both of them, the romance, while very important to the overall structure of the story, does take a back seat to the main plot, which is a big political intrigue mystery in both cases. And in both of these books, one of the 2 main protagonists is coming into this arranged marriage situation out of an abusive relationship, though in this case, the abusive ex is still alive. Something that is very different about this book, though, is that this is meant to set up a series. I don't know if there's going to be more books beyond book 2. It might just be a duology, but like at least a duology. And what held me back a bit in my star rating of this book was my sense that a lot of that main mystery plot in this one was kind of tangential to what I gather the main arc of the series probably is. And I kind of felt like it was a whole lot of ado about relatively little in the scope of what it is in this book that I cared most about and was looking forward to seeing continued in book 2. Like, the reason this lost a star for me and ended up being 4 stars is because I just didn't quite feel like the mystery plot in this book was worth this much pages and this much book. So, what's actually going on in this book? This is a fantasy book set in a world where we're mainly concerned with 2 kingdoms that don't have particularly strong relations with each other because they're divided by a large mountain range. The first of the 2 protagonists we meet is Velison, who is the 3rd son of a nobleman whose station in the world has risen significantly since the family has been given a large and strategically important estate. So his father is newly the lord of an estate that controls their kingdom's end of a mountain pass that goes to the other kingdom, which could be used as a trade route. Velison, though, is not in line to inherit anything. Although he's a member of the nobility and the leisure class, he is kind of at loose ends, living his own life in the city, until his father calls him back to tell him that he's arranged a strategic marriage for him in the other kingdom across the mountain pass. There is a cultural situation where the kingdom we're starting out this story in is incredibly homophobic. The kingdom across the mountains, though, is not and has marriage equality and stuff. Obviously, Velison is gay, his father doesn't know that, and there is this extremely unfortunate situation with the aforementioned abusive ex who shows up. I think anyone going into this book should be forewarned that there's an extremely graphic on-the-page rape scene that happens in the early chapters of this book. There's a reason for it being there, it's important to the story, it informs Velison's character arc going forward in ways that feel realistic and specific and understandable. And I think it's kind of the hardest thing to read in the book, so if you get past that, it'll probably be smoother sailing. Although I will give another content warning for later on. There is the violent death of a beloved animal, so like this is not a fluffy romance. But anyways, Velicen gets outed to his father in this particularly traumatizing way, and instead the ambassador from the family he's arranging this marriage with offers that he can marry the brother instead of the sister, and so he does. So most of the book takes place in the other country. You'll notice I'm not even trying with these fantasy place names, where we meet our second protagonist, Kay, which is short for something, although I forget what, and he is from the family that is the local, regional, governing family of a particular city. And as soon as Velicen arrives for this arranged marriage, there start to be these mysterious assassination attempts, and they have to solve this mystery together. Again, I felt like this mystery plot was a little overcomplicated and bloated for its place in this story. I feel like we're sort of promised from the beginning that the actual trade and political relations between these two countries is going to end up being a big focus of this series, but we don't really get there in book one. This ends up dealing almost entirely with the internal affairs in this one city in a way that I don't imagine will have a lot of implications more broadly, aside from the actual facts of the fallout of the events. But there are some great supporting characters in here I would like to see more of in a sequel, and this is the type of fantasy writing I think that has a type of world building that I really enjoy, where you get a lot more of nuanced cultural detail in terms of Velicen being from a different culture and having kind of culture shock, getting used to living in this new place, and the nuances of how the social structure is different, and depictions of things like clothes and food and all of that. I love all that, as opposed to big, epic, this is the history of the eras of our world type of world building. There is some magic in this, and it does become important to the plot, but it's not an overwhelming amount of magic system to learn about. And I do really like these two characters and how they complement each other. Velicen is someone who is very, very smart and perceptive and kind of good at scheming and sussing out intrigue, whereas Kay is a little more of a straightforward, earnest person who is good with a knife. I gave this 4 stars overall, looking forward to the sequel. Next, I read a book that has been my most disappointing read of the year so far, and that is Station Eternity by Lafferty. This book is so hard for me to talk about because it's so weird. I feel like it does not deliver what it promises, but I am having a hard time figuring out how I would have marketed this book more correctly for what it is. So what this book looks like it is a kind of sci-fi cozy mystery that is sort of self-aware of this trope that happens where all of these murders end up just spontaneously happening around the amateur detective character for them to solve. It's got this kind of classy, snazzy retro cover that indicates that it might be kind of lighthearted and fun. That was not the vibes of this book. This is a contemporary feeling in near future-ish science fiction novel in which first contact has happened with all of the many intelligent alien species of the universe. And our protagonist is Mallory, and yes, murders just keep happening around her everywhere she goes. And for some reason, she is also always the only person around who has the insight necessary to solve said murders. And so the whole premise of this book is clearly inspired by a genre, the cozy mystery series genre with the amateur detective who all the murders happen to. But I wouldn't say that it actually belongs to that genre. This is too much of a high-stakes sci-fi thriller to scratch that itch for anyone coming to this because they're intrigued by that cozy mystery premise. Basically, the whole question that undergirds this book is the thought experiment of supposing sci-fi scenario with alien civilizations, what might the science fictional explanation be for a character developing this particular very odd sort of superpower? And the main mystery of the book that is solved by the end isn't necessarily any of the multiple murders, but this mystery of Mallory's past and why this keeps happening to her. This has like a dizzyingly large array of point of view characters, but mainly two of them are the main protagonists. Mallory, who at the beginning of this book has escaped Earth and is one of officially only 2, but actually 3 humans who have been permitted to live aboard this alien space station. Humans aren't supposed to be allowed on this station yet, except for the human ambassador, but Mallory basically like asked for asylum in order to get away from all of the murders that kept happening around her on Earth, and the aliens have let her come. The other main character is a guy from Mallory's past, whose name I have completely forgotten, who is like stowing away on the station. We also get a bunch of his backstory. He has like a history with the military and he's kind of on the run. And then the big inciting incident at the beginning of this book is that without warning, Mallory learns that a whole like ship full of tourists from Earth has been permitted to arrive at the space station, and she's naturally freaked out because she thinks murders are going to start happening. And like, yeah, some murders happen, but also some like actual serious catastrophe that causes like mass death that made me go like, whoa, this is way more destruction than I thought I was signing up for. The thing I think I would highlight that some readers might actually really love about this book is all of the aliens. There are like some wacky, crazy, imaginative alien species and cultures and traditions described in this, and if you really enjoy that sort of off-the-wall sci-fi stuff, you might really like this book. That said, I didn't find myself emotionally invested in any of the characters, either human or alien, and we do get like a lot of backstory chapters for a lot of the characters who show up on this ship from Earth. They are all like possibly suspects, possibly victims, but it asks us to spend a lot of time getting to know each of them, and they weren't all worth that much page space to me. Several of them ended up sort of casually killed off. This was not my thing. I gave this 2 stars. Next, I read Tread of Angels by Rebecca Roanhorse, which I got from the library. This is a novella, and Rebecca Roanhorse is an author whose previous work, both in short and long form, I've had a kind of contentious relationship with, and this was kind of more of the same for me. Mixed bag here. This is like a supernatural western type fantasy setting, which seems superficially like a departure from other things that she's done, but I think this actually does have a lot in common with her previous work. This is still a mythological fantasy, but using Christian mythology as the basis instead of indigenous mythology. I think the best thing about this was probably its kind of dark, twisty plot, and the weakness, as with other novels by Rebecca Roanhorse that I've read, is the character work. Rebecca Roanhorse just doesn't write people who leap off the page to me. So this takes place in a world in which the human descendants of the fallen are like a societal underclass, and the protagonist Celeste and her sister Mariel are both mixed race, but while Celeste can pass for not fallen, her sister cannot. And so when her sister is arrested for murder of a powerful man, She is certain that her sister is innocent and has been framed, and also will not receive a fair trial. And so she sets out to try and solve the murder to try and prove her sister's innocence. She also has like a history with a very powerful demon who is maybe, maybe not her romantic interest. This has some very dark, twisty storytelling. If anyone remembers when Rebecca Roanhorse first burst onto the publishing scene, it was with a short story called This Is Your Authentic Indian Experience trademark. She won a Hugo for that short story. She won the Astounding Award for that short story. And personally, it was not my favorite thing in the world, but it was kind of this like devastating dark spiral of a gut punch, and it was very different from the books that she went on to publish after that, because it was this kind of like near future dystopia but on like a small personal level. It's not this big epic mythology stuff that she went on to publish. But this is the first thing of hers I've read since then that reminded me of the storytelling in that short story, in that it unwinds in this sort of intense, devastating way. And again, that story was not my personal favorite thing. Rebecca Roanhorse's character work in her longer fiction is not exactly my thing, but I think if you liked that short story, you should maybe give this one a try. I gave this one 3 stars. And then the last book I read in February of this year was The Red Scholar's Wake by Aliette de Bodard. This is the first novel in the Juya universe. It is a Vietnamese-inspired sapphic pirate sci-fi romance, and I could probably draw some comparisons between this and the other 2 queer romantic SFF books that have been in this wrap-up already, but I think my attempt to do comparisons overstayed its welcome. First of all, I'm a big fan of Aliette de Bodard. I've read quite a lot of her previous fiction in the Juya universe. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 stars. I was surprised upon visiting Goodreads recently to realize that this has a kind of shockingly low average Goodreads rating right now. And I was giving a think as to why that might be, because it honestly perplexed me a bit. And I was thinking that maybe this actually, despite being the first novel in this universe and sort of the start of a new sort of set of possibly future romance novels in this universe, this might not actually be the best introduction to the Juya universe for new readers. I think if you went into this having not read anything by Aliette de Bodard before, and you were told just like lesbian space pirate romance, you might have a very different set of expectations. Not necessarily about plot. I think this delivers plot-wise what you would expect, but just in terms of writing style, because the Juya stories and novellas generally have like a much denser writing style and world building style than I think many romance readers would expect. And of all the things that I've read in this universe, I really don't think this does the best job of explaining some of the tech that is really, really important and central to the story, how the mind ships work. One of these 2 protagonists, Ricefish, is literally a ship. The mind ships in this world can project a human avatar into various spaces, but their physical self is literally the spaceship. And concepts like how mind ships function as members of society, how the overlay technology that lets different types of things be overlaid in physical spaces, the bots, space travel through deep spaces. These are all concepts that are introduced, I think, much more thoroughly in other things of hers that I've read. So for a reader who really likes meaty science fiction concepts and is happy to be just like dropped in and try to figure out how it all works, as you go, that type of reader might actually get along with this very well, but I think this was marketed a little more as like, ooh, fun space romance, and like the Venn diagram overlap of those two types of reader might not be so vast. So the main protagonist of this book is a human. I'm gonna make a stab at the pronunciation of her name. Her name is Cashore. She is a scavenger who is very good with tech, who at the beginning of the book has been captured by pirates. She is being held aboard a pirate ship, Ricefish, as it turns out, and Ricefish has been recently widowed. She was the wife of the leader of her band of pirates, who was unexpectedly killed in a recent battle, and in the absence of the wife, Ricefish is leading the Red Banner. Ricefish makes Cashore an offer, which is a marriage as a practical arrangement as opposed to a romantic one. Ricefish could really use Cashore's expertise in helping figure out what happened in that battle that killed her wife. And she has some other personal reasons for wanting to make this type of an offer as well. Cashore is kind of horrified by the whole idea of pirates and of the foundation of violence and cruelty upon which this pirate society is founded. But Ricefish is ultimately an idealist who tries really hard to share with her this vision that she has always had, for a place outside of the tyrannical, legitimate society with its lack of opportunity, where even though it's founded on violence, yes, her people can be safe and there can be a sort of justice. This would not be an Aliette de Bodard romance without a nuanced exploration of the power dynamics between these two characters. You can also tell that she cares a lot about depictions of parenthood in her books. Cashore has a young daughter who is left behind at home and possibly in danger because her mother is absent. Ricefish has an estranged adult stepson who is also a pirate, but has very different ideas about what piratehood should be and should strive to achieve. And one of the big themes in here is, what sort of world do we want to build for our children? I have a few tiny quibbles here. One of them is that I think I would have liked to have been able to get to know Cashore better before she meets Ricefish. This is the type of romance story structure where like the book starts with the meeting between the two main characters, boom, and in this case, like, Cashore has already been captured by pirates, a lot has happened, and I would have liked to know her a little better earlier on to get a sense of like what she brings to this relationship. I've also now read enough things by Aliette de Bodard that had like a human, non-human romance element to it, to make me realize that I think her sex scenes between human and non-human characters are not quite for me, and this is such an intensely personal thing that I would not, actually deduct any points from the book for this. I have seen other people claim that they think the sex in this is the hottest thing they've ever read, so your mileage may vary. So overall, I thought this was very good, just maybe not the best place to start with the Julia Universe stuff. I would recommend either The Tea Master and the Detective or Seven of Infinities, which are both novellas with a bit more of a mystery bent, although Seven of Infinities is also romance-ish. Something that I personally really appreciate about Aliette de Bodard as an author is that in the years that I have been reading her books, her writing has sort of shifted in the same direction that my reading preferences have shifted in over the same stretch of time. Some of her earlier stuff that I read, like On a Red Station Drifting and Citadel of Weeping Pearls, are kind of more poignant, bittersweet, melancholy science fiction. And then she's leaned more and more into like both mystery and romance in her work in recent years in a way that I have personally really enjoyed. Like, a lot of the themes are kind of the same, but the sets of tropes are different. Anyways, 4 stars for the Red Scholar's Wake. Very excited for a Fireborn of Exile later this year. And that is it. That is finally the end of the double February wrap-up. Let me know if you've read any of these books and what you think. Let me know if you're interested in any of them. Anyhow, I hope you're having a very nice day. That is all. Bye for now.